So let's give a warm welcome to Scott Spoolman.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me okay? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's really great to be back in Wausau. You know, we made a lot of trips here. Because of this, because of the river, you know, this town is such a rich geologic and historical treasure trove, and it gives a certain special feel that a river town has, in my opinion anyway. Made many trips here to explore Rib Mountain and 9 Mile Forest and the dells of the Eau Claire out there to the east, and Wausau itself. So we've spent a lot of enjoyable time here in the area. A few years ago, we were right here in this museum to present another book, and we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. And maybe some of you were here that day. If so, thanks for being here then, and thanks for being here now. We're happy to be back. So, and by we, I mean my wife, Gail Martinelli, and me. She's in the second row there, second person over. Just take a minute to introduce and thank Gail. She's my fellow explorer and partner in this effort, and given me invaluable help with photographs and ideas and research, coaching, managing, just about everything. So thank you, Gail. All right, so I also want to take a minute to thank some people who made it possible for us to be here, you know, namely Cheryl and Ben and the people who've helped us out today, Eric and Beth and Kevin in the back there, and all the other staff who've made it possible for us to be here. I also want to thank the Yankee Bookstore for sponsoring the talk. Well, we're here to talk about Wisconsin waterways, including the Wisconsin River, which you see pictured here on the cover of my book. The book is The Wisconsin Waters, The Ancient History of Lakes, Rivers, and Waterfalls, published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. And it showcases the geologic and natural history of Wisconsin by taking you on a journey to explore many of the state's waterways. And this book is in the same vein as my other book with the Historical Society Press, Wisconsin State Parks, Extraordinary Stories of Geology and Natural History. This one came out in 2018. Both books include trail or travel guides to help you get out and explore and see for yourself what I've been writing about. And between those two books, I also put out a book called Wisconsin Rocks, a guidebook to 52 geologic sites of interest all around the state, published by Mountain Press Publishers. This is more of a guidebook, a little bit briefer. It kind of complements the historical material in my other books. Well, people often ask how I got into writing these books. And I've been fascinated with Wisconsin's natural settings, you know, its forests, fields, and waters, since I was about 5, when my older brother John took me on the first of many hikes in the woods and fields around Cumberland, in the northwest corner of the state. That's where I went to school early on. My very first hike, I can remember pretty clearly, even at 5, and I think it looked a lot like this field here. Later, we moved to Hayward, where I went to high school. John got me out on the first of many river trips shown here. This was just a few years ago. John in the back, me in the front there, stern and bow. And I fell in love with canoeing in the Namakagon River, which is where we were. So I proudly dedicated the book to my brother, John. Regarding Wisconsin's waterways, there is plenty to talk about. Water is so important to us here in Wisconsin, as I summarized in the following passage from my book's preface, which also kind of neatly fits the theme of waterways. Tucked into the corner of the upper Midwest, formed by two great I mentioned this is from the preface of the book, sorry. Tucked into the corner of the upper Midwest, formed by two of the Great Lakes and bordered on its west side by North America's largest river, Wisconsin is framed by waterways and rich in various water features. Within its borders lie 15,000 lakes, most of them formed by glaciers some 10,000 years ago. The state is laced with more than 12,600 rivers and streams that trickle or surge over dozens of waterfalls that mesmerize many visitors every year. Each of Wisconsin's waterways has a story to tell, and together these stories create a complex tapestry woven together in time and space by the flow of Wisconsin's waters. Well, let's look into the book, and starting with the first chapter, which is a big picture kind of chapter, addressing questions like, how did oceans full of water wind up on planet Earth? And how much of that water is available to us? And it's that availability question that was a real eye-opener for me. This slide might help you to visualize how finite our water resource is. The large blue circle, let's see, where's my pointer here? The large blue circle here represents all the water on Earth. And this second largest circle, this one here, represents all the fresh water on the planet because the lion's share of the water is salty ocean water, 97%. And in the tiny little dot right down here below the second size dot is all the fresh water in all the lakes, rivers, and streams in the world. So it's a very small fraction of 1% of the global water supply that's available readily available for use by all the world's plants and animals and nearly 8 billion people. My hope is that with an awareness of this finite nature of our water supply, we'll be motivated to protect this invaluable resource. And just exploring chapter 1 a little bit further, another part of the big picture is the immense time frame for the geologic and natural history of our region. You can see how this graphic starts way down here, 4.5 billion years ago with the formation of the planet, and it winds up through the eons to the Cambrian period here, which is about 545 million years ago. That's when life began to evolve rapidly and diversify on the planet. And this graphic continues through millions of years, through evolution and extinction of all different kinds of animals, including the dinosaurs. All of human history fits on the last sliver here, 4 to 5,000 years. So these eons included major geologic events and processes, including continental collisions and volcanic eruptions, flooding by ancient seas, and massive glaciers. And chapter 1 in my book describes how those forces and processes shaped our states, waterways, and landscapes. And a really important aspect of this time frame is the fact that for a long, long time, the region that is now Wisconsin was tropical. Early in its history, the crust of the earth was fractured into several big pieces called plates that were bumped and shifted around on the planet, driven by the intense heat of the planet's interior. This process was called plate tectonics. The plate on which Wisconsin rode, called the North American plate, was in 600 million years ago, Precambrian time, was south of the equator. And then over time, because of plate tectonics, it took a kind of a curlicue path, crossed the equator heading north about 350 million years ago. And then it kept going and landed in its current position about 10 million years ago. And we're still moving. The North American plate now is moving roughly southwest, about as fast as our fingernails are growing. And the fact that Wisconsin was tropical for so long explains why we've discovered a lot of evidence of plant and animal life in our state that could only have come from the tropics, as you'll see in a little while here. Well, beyond chapter 1, The next 4 chapters of my book cover 4 regions of the state, roughly sketched out here. The book is designed so that you can read those 4 chapters in any order that you want. You might want to read chapter 1 if you need an introduction to or just a review of geologic principles, natural history, the basics of that. Each regional chapter then begins with a map like this one, showing the sites to be visited, and an introduction in the text of each chapter gives more background on that part of the state. This is followed by 4 to 6 sections per chapter, each of which covers a waterway or a set of waterways, for a total of 19 sites across all 4 chapters. So let's just do a quick preview. Chapter 2 covers the Northern Highlands, that area there, a little bit more in north central Wisconsin than this map shows, but that part of the state has the iconic lakes, and the Lake Superior shore, which I'll talk a little bit more about here, and 4 key rivers, including the Brule River, shown here, flows into Lake Superior. Chapter 3, the northeastern ridges and lowlands, explores some enticing waterfalls, as well, like this one up in Menominee County, as well as it covers the lower. I'm getting ahead of myself here. As well as important rivers, the Bay of Green Bay, and the Upper Lake Michigan shore, including the famous Door County sites like this one from Peninsula State Park. Next, chapter 4 covers the southeastern glacial showcase. Covers the lower Lake Michigan shore with its dunes and other beautiful sites. Lake Winnebago, Horicon Marsh, and the Yahara Lakes around Madison. This slide shows Big Springs that feeds the Lake Winger, which is the smallest of the 5 lakes. And finally, the southwest, the driftless area with its mysterious ancient rivers, like the Kickapoo, shown here. Can you see the canoeists in that photo? They just slid into view there as Gail was taking this picture. This chapter also covers the lower Wisconsin River, Devil's Lake, and of course the vast valley of the Mississippi River. This is a photo taken from an overlook at Nelson Dewey State Park. Okay, let's delve a little deeper into a couple of those specific stories. And after we do that, we'll come back here to home in Wausau and talk a little bit about your segment of the Wisconsin River. Then we'll start with a favorite destination for many people, the shore of Lake Superior. As with each of my sites, I do the deep story of how the area was formed, following that with a travel guide, which you can use to see evidence of the history close up. Now, the story of Lake Superior dates back to an event called the Mid-Continent Rift, in which a great crevice formed across much of the ancient North American continent about 1.1 billion years ago. A giant plume of magma, or hot fluid rock, had worked its way up from deep in the mantle of the earth to the crust and found cracks and crevices and pried them open and created this great crevice. And over a period of about 25 million years, it spewed lava from that crevice. It stretched roughly from Kansas up through what would become the Lake Superior Basin, and then down across Michigan. Obviously, the lakes weren't here; they're shown for reference. But and this rift area is shown by this reddish brown, which makes up much of the bedrock of northwestern Wisconsin. This rift spewed untold tons of lava across this tinted area here, creating layer upon layer of a dense black rock called basalt. Now makes up the bedrock or the foundation underlying much of northwestern Wisconsin and the whole area along where the rift was. In what would become the Lake Superior Basin, the land slowly subsided or sank under its own weight because of all those layers of rock. It sank into the zone of softer, more pliable rock called the mantle. This created the huge trough-shaped depression where Lake Superior now lies. And the subsidence was due to the steadily increasing mass of basalt and other types of rock, including the beautiful Lake Superior sandstone, tinted red because of the presence of iron in that rock. And it's shown here on the shore of Big Bay State Park on Madeline Island. This type of rock famously lines the Bayfield Peninsula and the Apostle Islands. Another geologic process that affected the northern highlands was the creation of the Wisconsin Dome, represented by this greenish area here. The whole area was just slightly raised up close to 1 billion years ago by geologic forces probably related to that rifting and then the subsidence into the lake basin. And this area became elevated just enough to make the land slope gently away from the center in all directions, east, southwest. So it's important because that kind of determines the flow of all the streams up in that area. They all flow off of the dome. Yet another geologic event that helped to shape the Lake Superior shore region occurred somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion years ago, when the primitive North American continent collided with another continent at its southeastern edge. The collision compressed the crust and caused blocks of land called fault blocks to be thrust upward. And such a fault block was raised up parallel to and south of the Lake Superior shore, roughly where this border between the gray and the red is here. That's about where the Douglas Fault was. It's called the Douglas Fault. And it created cliffs like this one at Pattison State Park near the city of Superior. This is the far northwest corner of the state. Here the Black River crashes over the Douglas Fault at Big Manitou Falls. It's the highest waterfall in the state, 4th highest in the eastern United States. Then the Douglas Fault crops up in various places along the Lake Superior shore. Several streams flow over it. This is Amnicon River at Amnicon Falls State Park, just east of Pattison. It's 3 or 4 beautiful little waterfalls in that park. This chapter goes on to describe how the Apostle Islands and Chequamegon Bay were formed. The Apostles out here off the end of the Bayfield Peninsula. And here's beautiful little Chequamegon Bay where Ashland is. These were formed largely by the glaciers, which molded much of the landscape around the lake, along with the meltwaters of the glacier, the water melting off. Those meltwaters sat in a glacial lake in the Lake Superior Basin for many centuries, depositing red clay that now lines much of the southern shore of Lake Superior. It explains how plant and animal communities, my book explains how plant and animal communities developed in the area after the glacier retreated. I also look into early human communities along the shore, just such as the archaic people, which included the old copper culture. Beginning about 6,000 years ago, native people learned to extract shallow deposits of copper in the Lake Superior, on the Lake Superior shore, as well as in other areas around the Great Lakes. This image I found online, it's from the Milwaukee Public Museum. And those people made all kinds of tools, weapons, and eventually personal ornaments out of copper. They're thought to be the world's first metalsmiths. And later came the Ojibwe, came the woodland people, and most recently the Ojibwe, who had expanded across much of northern Wisconsin when the European explorers first arrived in the 1700s. By 1854, though, the U.S. government had reduced the Ojibwe lands to the 8 reservations shown here outlined in yellow. Just 3 of them on the shore, the Bad River Band, the Red Cliff Band, and out on Madeline Island, there's another part of the Bad River Band. Tiny fraction of the land that their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. And at the end of the Lake Superior Shore section of my book is a travel guide. In this case, I traced a route for traveling along the shore that would best allow you the best access to the sites along the shore. Just described the drive. I'll actually read a sample of the travel guide just to give you a sense of how it works. This covers this part of the shore around the town of Cornucopia. All right, let's first do that. Highway 13 descends into the valley of the Siskiwit River, where Wisconsin's northernmost town, Cornucopia, overlooks Siskiwit Bay. Just west of town is the Lost Creek Bog State Natural Area, where rising lake levels have put the mouths of 3 creeks underwater. These 3 creeks descend from the hills to the south, and one of them forms a gorgeous, secluded waterfall called Lost Creek Falls. A side trip there involves a 1.5-mile hike, highly recommended. And we really enjoyed our hike there, Gail and I did. Then the travel guide goes on to explain how to find the trailhead for this hike, and it continues. Out of Cornucopia, Highway 13 passes the west end of the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, famous for its intricately carved caves, pillars, and arches in colorful Lake Superior sandstone. Some of this stretch displays stunning flows of ice during winter, making the Bayfield Peninsula Ice Caves a world-renowned destination for hardy winter hikers and kayakers. And one of those hardy winter kayakers took this photo for me, a crazy guy who lives up there. I can't imagine kayaking in there myself, but it must be great. There's much more to explore in this area, and you can learn from my book if you wish. But now let's leave the Lake Superior shore and travel southeast across the state to Horicon Marsh, which appears in Chapter 4. This great marsh, one of the largest freshwater cattail marshes in the world, was venerated by none other than the great writer and scientist Aldo Leopold in his classic A Sand County Almanac in a reading called Marshland Elegy, as follows. A dawn wind stirs on the great marsh. With almost imperceptible slowness, it rolls a bank of fog across the wide morass. Like the white ghost of a glacier, the mists advance riding over phalanxes of tamarack, sliding over bog waters heavy with dew. A single silence hangs from horizon to horizon. Great writing. And my Horicon story begins with that quotation, followed by the story of the marsh, beginning with how the basin for the marsh was scooped out, probably by several glaciers, beginning as long as 2.5 million years ago. And most of that carving was done by the most recent glacier, the one named after Wisconsin. And it created this huge basin that lies mostly in Dodge County, a little bit in Fond du Lac. It's 13 miles long, 4 miles wide. It was then filled by water melting off the glacier to become what's called a glacial lake, a pool of icy meltwater. And back then, this area was a tundra. It might have looked something like this artist's rendition. It would have hosted only the hardiest of ground cover plants, lichens, mosses, some grasses, eventually stunted tree species. The animals in the area included woolly mammoths, musk oxen, mastodons, caribou, and probably large cats, as you can see in that lower right of this image. It's possible that Horicon even hosted giant beavers, larger than today's black bears. and weighing as much as 350 pounds. Evidence of such animals has been found in this area and other parts of Wisconsin. And for many decades after the glacier had shaped the Horicon Basin and receded to the north, the area remained tundra where mammoths ranged across the plain, munching on the grasses. Here's a picture of Gail getting to know the last remaining woolly mammoth. So, stands up there at Horicon like a sentinel, kind of overlooking the marsh. It's a full-scale replica. The mammoths were extinct by about 11,000 years ago, but they may have been watching as humans moved into the area around 1,000 years before that. Nearly every major prehistoric native culture known to the upper Midwest is thought to have used Horicon Marsh, including the paleo hunters pictured here. They hunted mammoths and the other large mammals. The word Horicon is derived from an Algonquin term meaning land of clean, pure water. Effigy mound builders had established camps or villages and built mounds all around Horicon Marsh between 700 and 1200 AD. One of the best surviving clusters of mounds in the state is up there at Horicon at Nitschke Mounds County Park near the southwest corner of the marsh, shown here. The Horicon Marsh story ends well, at least to this point. This is what it looks like today. But beginning around 1800, the marsh went through a tortured period. It was first flooded to facilitate logging, followed by overhunting to the point where ducks and other waterfowl populations were nearly wiped out. Later, people drained it to allow for farming, which did not work out. Here's a picture of a plowed area where one of those failed farming attempts was made. In fact, the draining and plowing caused many of the peat deposits deep under the marsh to catch fire. And they burned for years until most of that peat had largely turned to muck. It was a real mess. But then in 1921, concerned citizens began the long process of restoration and protection of the marsh. And today it's completely protected. As you can see, the northern 2/3 is the Horicon National Wildlife Refuge. The southern third is the Horicon Marsh State Wildlife Area. And the marsh is even recognized by the United Nations as a wetland of international importance. And you can walk through the marsh on boardwalks and earthen dikes to get close-up views of the various flowering plant species. This is a photo that Gail took of a milkweed flower with cattails behind it there. The marsh hosts countless species of insects, including the endangered monarch butterfly that depends on the milkweed. And you'll see amphibians and reptiles and, of course, birds. Birds and more birds. More than 300 species of birds, including pelicans, egrets, herons, swans, cranes, and ibises use the marsh. This photo and the first one you saw of the marsh at dawn were taken by Jack Bartholme of the Friends of Horicon Marsh. And we owe those friends a great debt of gratitude for their ongoing work to restore and protect the marsh. And my hat's off to any Friends group. If any of you are members of a Friends of group, I thank you for that. As with all my stories, I follow this one with a travel guide, basically a driving route around the marsh on county highways and state highways. But you can also bike it. Lots of people bike around the marsh. And by the way, a little side note, this is right now through May, into the first part of June, is really a great time to go to Horicon if you like to see flowers and birds and migrating birds. It's a great time to go there. You'll want to start your trip to visit the Horicon Marsh Visitor and Education Center. It's provided again by the Friends of Horicon Marsh. It's an impressive collection of artifacts and exhibits and information. And from the marsh, from the visitor center, you can take hikes all over that marsh on miles and miles of trails. To finish the Horicon Marsh story, here's a reading from my book that takes us back to Aldo Leopold. In 1948, Leopold expressed some pessimism about the restoration of Horicon Marsh. Observing the brutal and widespread disturbances to the marsh, he feared that someday quote, the last crane will trumpet his farewell and spiral skyward from the giant marsh, unquote. No doubt, Leopold would be pleased to see that his pessimism was unwarranted in the long run. The marsh has survived those disturbances to become a thriving marshland ecosystem. And indeed, this is one of the most remarkable stories that I've ever read of natural restoration that can occur when people value a place and then they work together to protect it and preserve it and an area that they care about. Well, now, wherever I go, I like to research and talk about local waterway. And here in Wausau, we might just as well talk about that big old river that flows right through town here. Here's how I introduced the Wisconsin River in my book. Get that slide up. Here we go. A photographer's description of the Wisconsin River might make it seem like a docile giant. A 430-mile stream that rises in Wisconsin's deep north woods, meanders southward across most of the state's length, and then swings westward to flow across the ancient driftless area, emptying quietly into the Mississippi River. It drops just 1,067 feet, or 2.5 feet per mile on average, between its source and its mouth. The river may indeed be docile, but the long, wide Wisconsin River Valley belies a history of upheaval, including continental collisions, a great rift in the planet's crust, crushing glaciers, and catastrophic floods. And here's an interesting sidelight. Most of you may know this. I didn't. Did you know that Wisconsin is named after the river, not the other way around? The state is named after the river. I didn't know that until I started writing. Father Jacques Marquette and trader Louis Joliet explored the river in 1673. Marquette is thought to have been the first to record the river's name, and he called it the Mescousing, which is an Algonquin term meaning stream that flows through something red. And that red something, they figure, was probably the reddish sandstone of that's now known as the Wisconsin Dells. So the name Mescousing is thought to have morphed into Wisconsin and Wisconsin by 1700s, and then Wisconsin by the early 19th century. So the powers that be chose that name. They named it after the river that runs through the heart of the state. Okay, I cover the upper and lower Wisconsin River in separate chapters because their stories are so markedly different. They're actually two different rivers, as it turns out. But we'll focus on the upper Wisconsin, the stretch here between the river's source at Lac Vieux Desert and all the way down to Portage, which is about there. And this stretch this was shaped by major geologic events. For example, 1.8 billion years ago, the primitive North American continent collided with another landmass, and over many millions of years, this mashing together of two continents heaved up a major mountain range called the Pinocchian Mountains. Geologists think it had a footprint about like that of the Appalachians today. stretching across Minnesota and northern parts of Wisconsin and Michigan on into New York and Ontario. And the roots of these ancient mountains are exposed in various places in the state. And one of the best exposures is here at Grandfather Falls, north of Merrill. I'm sure many or most of you have been up there. The huge polished boulders in that rapids, some of them are 10 feet or more in diameter, are Precambrian rock, some of the oldest rock in the state. I mentioned that the Wisconsin River is largely a docile river, but as you can see, Grandfather Falls can be a roaring cascade of rapids, anything but docile. Gail took this picture during high water a few years ago when we visited here. Of course, the biggest players in the shaping of the Wisconsin River Valley were the glaciers. The most recent of which is shown here. It's the one named after Wisconsin. Ice masses advanced from the north carrying incredibly huge amounts of silt, sand, gravel, and boulders, and dropping them all across the land as it melted away. And throughout the Wisconsin River Valley, upper Wisconsin River Valley, this glacial debris, or glacial till as it's called, averages 100 feet deep. So the valley of the upper Wisconsin is set into glacially formed landscape. And that glacier might have looked something like this, present-day glacier in Greenland, just inching its way across the state. Beginning about 18,000 years ago, it began to melt, and as it retreated, massive flows of meltwater moved the glacial debris around in the river valley. Meltwaters flowed for many centuries, spreading untold volumes of clay, sand, silt, gravel, called outwash, across the Wisconsin River Valley, everywhere downstream of the Wood Lake moraine, which is just to the north of Merrill. As you may know, the last glacier stopped shy of Wausau. It didn't quite make it to Wausau. One interesting example of the meltwaters shaping the lands and waterscapes is the confluence of the Rib and Wisconsin River here in Wausau, Lake Wausau. They were both carrying. Here's the Rib coming in here. Is the Wisconsin coming down. They were both carrying huge loads of glacial debris when they were meltwater streams. The Wisconsin River carried a lot more outwash because it was draining a much larger area and it was a bigger river. And so its sand and gravel piled up faster than that of the Rib and effectively made a natural dam right there, which is what backed up the Rib to make Lake Wausau and that great wetland of the Rib, the lower Rib. Quite a beautiful place and ecologically important. And that's I noticed that when I came in that I guess that's Lake Wausau over there in that painting on the right there. So let's see. Okay, sorry, let's see here. All right. This photo I took just south of Stevens Point on a stretch of the river that is interesting for another reason. This segment is about 40 miles south of here. It lies very near what was the northern shore of a huge lake that existed during glacial times called Glacial Lake Wisconsin. And here's what Glacial Lake Wisconsin looked like. The glacier is shown over here by this white line. The Wisconsin Dells as it exists, the location of Wisconsin Dells is here, Mauston's there, Wisconsin Rapids is up there, Wausau, of course, is to the north, and the Baraboo Hills are shown here. Now, about 19,000 years ago, the Green Bay lobe of the glacier, which is this one here, was flowing in from the east, and it crept into the Baraboo Hills right there. And when it did, it blocked the flow of the ancient Wisconsin River, which was going around the end of the Baraboo Hills, blocked it and backed that river up to make a lake as big as the Great Salt Lake in Utah. As you can see, it was bound on the southwest side by these highlands of the driftless area, and over here on the east, the waters lapped against that wall of ice that was melting away eventually. If that lake existed today, the cities of Black River Falls, Neelsville, Stevens Point would all be sitting right about on its shore. Friendship, Mauston, Wisconsin Rapids would all be underwater. Glacial Lake Wisconsin sat in the glacial deep freeze for 3,000 or more years, while its waves and currents, driven by the high winds of glacial times, wore away at the high sandstone ridges, buttes, and mounds that stood as islands in that lake. And a number of them remain today. I'm sure some of you have seen some of them, standing as mute reminders of that great glacial lake. And they include Mill Bluff, from which I took this photo. You're looking at Bee Bluff in the foreground, and that's Camel Bluff, I think, in the back there. They lie within Mill Bluff State Park. Here's Castle Rock, not too far from Mill Bluff. And these structures were whittled and partly dismantled by the glacial lake's waves and currents for hundreds, thousands of years. And the waters shifted the sand grains evenly across the ancient lake bed to form what is today the Central Sand Plains, which Gail and I drove across to come up today. So what was holding this great body of water back? Well, it was a series of dams located down here on this end of the lake, one there, kind of where the Wisconsin Dells is now. And those dams were made mostly of ice, but also of loosely bound sand and gravel that had been hauled by the glacier. These dams, toward the end of the glacial period, as temperatures warmed, and it was only a matter of time before those dams would give way. And when they did, the lake's waters drained very rapidly. As I wrote in this chapter of my book, the tremendous volume of water must have flowed with incredible fury as it quickly stripped away the lake bottom and glacial sediments and began carving up the underlying sandstone. Geologists estimate that within a few days or weeks, the entire Great Glacial Lake had drained away. In the process, it sculpted the famous gorge of the Wisconsin Dells, along with similar dramatic features such as the glen at Mirror Lake State Park. And this was the result. Exquisite rock formations in a canyon of sandstone known as the Wisconsin Dells, carved by that powerful flood. And that flood took place in the blink of an eye by geologic standards. And the dells are also featured on the cover of my book, which is fitting because the Wisconsin River flows right through the heart of Wisconsin, so I'm glad that this is the cover of the book. Well, that's a sample of the stories in Wisconsin waters, and I hope that this book, along with its travel guides, will help you to get out and explore some waterways, including the Wisconsin River. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you again, and I'll be happy to sign a copy of any of my books if you wish when we're done. Now, however, I could take questions if anybody has any questions. Be happy to answer them.
Does your book go through any of the history of the Wolf River system emptying into the Wisconsin?
Yes. The Wolf River.
Entering into through Portage when they combined back in the day?
Well, there was a fear. I mean, there was a fear that, the question is, does my book cover the Wolf River and how it emptied into the Wisconsin? Excuse me. My understanding is that the Wolf and the Wisconsin, they flow together, very close together, which is why they put a canal across at some point, hoping to make it into a big shipping lane. My understanding is that the Wolf never actually did drain into the Wisconsin. In fact, some people were afraid it might be the other way around. The Wolf is actually a little bit lower than the Wisconsin. So when the spring floods came, that area between the Wisconsin and Wolf Rivers would turn into a massive floodplain. And eventually the waters from the higher level, which is the Wisconsin, would wear through that floodplain and escape into the Wolf River Valley and then go out to Lake Winnebago and then on up to Green Bay. So that's why they built levees along the Wisconsin River in Portage, to prevent the river from escaping or actually being pirated, as the geologists call it, from one place to another. The Wisconsin River might well have diverted and gone up the Wolf River. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of the Lower Fox. I'm getting mixed up now. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, I apologize. It's the Fox. I'm sorry. Okay, the Wolf.
You can get to the Fox from the Wolf.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I apologize. The Wolf, I did cover the Wolf, but I don't remember. I didn't find any evidence of the wolf escaping.
Well, I don't, I was reading a book on the riverboats.
Yeah.
And how they were trying to have the riverboats, the Wolf Fox River system get into the Wisconsin system where they could combine and
Yeah.
eventually end up in the Mississippi.
Yeah, well, I know that there was hope of connecting the Fox, and they did connect the Fox to the Wisconsin, but I don't remember the Wolf being part of that. Sorry.
Well, the Wolf ends right in the Waterways.
It ends in that pool, yeah, the Lake Winnebago pool, the pool of lakes down there. So you read that the Wolf might have
I was
been.
wondering if because like I said, I studied some history on those two, and the traffic that they were trying to utilize
Right.
for quite some time, and then
Yeah.
ultimately gave up on it.
Yeah, they dammed the Wolf and parts of the Wolf, and that would have been part of an effort to get shipping up the Wolf. But I'm sorry if I'm not answering your question. Sorry. Yeah, and again, I'm sorry I mixed up the Wolf and the Fox, or the Fox and the Wolf. Yeah.
They're both four-legged animals.
Yeah, I get them mixed up all the time. Yeah. Yes.
The latitude of Wausau versus Minneapolis-St. Paul is quite similar, but our weather is very different in terms of degree of cold and degree of warmth. And I read over the years a reference to a feature in central and northern Wisconsin called the Laurentian Shield. And I'm wondering, does that have a relationship to the Wisconsin dome that you featured early on?
Yeah.
Is that, because it has a big impact, I'm going to say big, but it does have a significant impact on our weather in central Wisconsin.
Well, the Laurentian Shield is, as far as I know, it's the core of ancient North America. It's the beginning of North America. Pieces of other continents got jammed onto because of plate tectonics. Eventually, the Laurentian Shield is like a big plate-shaped hunk of granite that's centered, I think, up around. Drawing a blank in Canada, the big bay. Hudson Bay. and it comes down. Wisconsin was on the south edge of that plate, and then pieces got jammed onto it to form Wisconsin. So that's the Laurentian Shield. And the Laurentian ice sheet, of course, that's something different. That's the ice. That's the glacier. But that's what my understanding of the Laurentian Shield. I did not know that it would affect the weather, however. It's basically the bedrock. It determines what's bedrock there. Over in Minnesota, Minneapolis is all flood plain. It's all made by the Mississippi and the glaciers that flowed through there. So it's a lot of glacial till lying under Minneapolis and St. Paul. So I don't know that it affects the weather, though. Honestly, I don't know how that would be. I know that I lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul for a long time. I know that a lot of weather would come across that prairie to the west, and we'd have really brutally cold winters and really wicked storms in the summer.
And then you sent the leftover to Wisconsin.
Yeah. Well, I'm from Wisconsin, so that's why I came back. No, yeah. No, yeah.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
If you had to choose your favorite waterway or state park, what would you say that would be?
Well, I'm asked this quite a bit. It's kind of like being asked who's your favorite kid. You know, it's kind of hard to answer because I could easily make a top 10 list of state parks and a top 10 list of waterways, but maybe it's just because of, you know, we all kind of harken back to our old stomping grounds, and I'm from northwestern Wisconsin. I love the Lake Superior shore. It's hard for me to resist any trip up there. And all the rivers that flow into that lake, you know, the Montreal and the Brule and the Amnicon, those are just incomparably beautiful places to go. And then kind of similarly, Copper Falls State Park is my favorite state park. That's up there by Mellon, where ancient rivers are carving up an ancient fault zone for 200 million years, and you feel like you're walking back that far in time when you walk through the gates at Copper Falls. But all the waterways have their own reasons to be somebody's favorite. They're just beautiful. So.
You just named my favorite area as well.
Anybody else have a question? Well, thanks a lot for your attention. Nice to be here.